The purpose of this video is to demonstrate how to create mission center of gravity travel diagrams like this and potato diagrams like this using the Jet 10 software. So to create diagrams like that, you first need to create a diagram like this that takes your aircraft configuration and attempts to determine where you carry things like fuel and also things like missiles. Because when we did the conceptual design of this aircraft, we used generic locations for those things. We put them where they wouldn't cause any trouble. But now we have to figure out where they really go and deal with it. So that's the nature of this exercise. So once you've created a diagram like this that gives you an idea where things are going to fit, where fuel is going to fit in particular, and then likewise a diagram like this that gives you an idea where the payload is going to fit, especially the expendable payload, then assuming you have then you can go into your JET program and model these locations in place of the generic locations that you had before. Now, these particular people remove the location scale, the grid, from the background of the aircraft drawing, but that's okay because there's a nice drawing that they did for the landing gear that has the echolocations of everything, and by comparing those we can figure out where everything goes. So here's what we do. We go to the Jet 10 file, we go to the Weight tab, and we scroll down to the end here. And notice how all the expendable payload was placed at the location where the center of gravity ends up. So the center of gravity doesn't move very much between takeoff and landing. And the fuel was evenly distributed fore and aft of that. Well, that may not be where it actually ends up in JET, in the diagram that you made of where things fit. So the first thing we have to do here is we have to replace these equations in these cells here with numbers. So we just highlight them. It's cells B33 through B37. Right now the equations determine what those values are, but we need to freeze those values so that we can start burning fuel and firing missiles and setting individual values to 0. So I'm going to copy all of those, and then I'm going to right click and paste special, or depending on the version of Excel you have, it may give you a series of little icons, but we're just going to paste the values. So the interface may not look exactly like that, but now there's just numbers in those cells, and we can work with that. Okay, so let's go back to our PowerPoint and figure out where things go. Let's start with the missiles. We have 2 weapons bays. I mean, we have 4, but 2 at one echolocation and 2 at another echolocation. So half the missiles go here, half the missiles go here. And there's basically 4 missiles at each location. So we need to figure out where those locations are. The centroid of a missile is about half its length. So that's just a little ahead of where the leading edge of the wing meets the inlet. So we take a look at that, and we go over here and find that same point right about there, and it is, and then we compare it to the scale down here. And it's about 26 feet. Okay? And so that's where the forward missile bay should be, at 26 feet. If we look at the aft missile bays, they should be just a little ahead of where the trailing edge of the wing meets the fuselage. Let's take a look at that. Trailing edge of the wing meets fuselage right about here. Okay, and that's right about there, which is about maybe 41 feet. So let's do 26 feet and 41 feet. Okay? The forward missile bay is actually at 26 feet, and the aft missile bay is actually at 41 feet. Again, all these numbers were being set by equations, so we have to do them differently now. Have to do them by where things will actually fit. Alright, so that's missile bays. Now let's look at fuel. There's a large fuselage fuel tank here between the inlets behind the cockpit, and that's probably going to hold half the aircraft fuel. The wings are very thin, they have a lot of area for fuel tank, but it's not very thick, so I'm going to say the other half goes in these two wing tanks. Okay? So let's look at the locations of those. The forward fuel tank is halfway back down the inlet, and the wing fuel tanks are kind of midway, centroid of the wing, more or less. So the forward fuel tank is also at about 25. Let's put that in jet. So the forward fuel tank's at 25 feet, and it carries half the fuel. So the fuel is actually these numbers divide the fuel up equally between three tanks. So I can just take that number, whatever it happens to be, multiply by 3, and divide by 2, and that's half my fuel. And the other half is that number multiplied by 3 divided by 4, because each of the wing fuel tanks is a quarter of the fuel. And then this one is just equal to the one above it. Okay, and the locations of the wing tanks are centroid of the wing 30, I'm going to say 37. Okay, you can be more precise. I'm just doing a quick demo, so I'm not being terribly precise, but you can measure that out very accurately. Both of those are at 37. So that's the locations of everything in our design. So now we have to calculate the normal CG travel. Okay, and one of the issues is that you're not going to be able to Control Z to go back where you were. So as a safety measure, I'm going to, so that I can start over again, I'm going to copy these numbers here and paste them down here so that I can easily restore these numbers after I've done setting them all to 0. So we're starting off with a CG location here at 32.85 feet, but we want to plot it as a percent Mach. So 28.73 Mach is the location. So what we're going to do, we're going to make that plot, and let's take a look at it again. We're going to make that plot of center of gravity in percent Mach as a function of weight. So we're starting out at takeoff, or before takeoff, and then we're doing the start taxi takeoff, we're doing the acceleration and climb, and we're burning fuel from different tanks as we go. And that's how we get ultimately to tanks empty, weapons gone. We also shoot weapons in here, combat shoot missiles. So we want to record each step of the way so that we can make a plot. So let's go over here. I'm going to say its center of gravity, xcg, is the independent variable, and weight is the dependent variable. So this is first the ideal case. We're going to have all the different cases. To do the potato diagram, we do the worst case where the CG ends up as far forward as it can get, and we also do the worst case where the CG ends up as far aft as it can get. And we're going to do it all by expending and zeroing out different sections of the CG and weight calculations here on the weight tab. Alright, so we're going to start with the XCG at 28.73%, and we can't link these because they're going to keep changing. Okay, so, oh wait, no, I'm sorry, 21.77. 21.77% MAC. We want the CG location. Neutral point, we want to plot that as well eventually, so we can compare. And then the weight there is 39,300. Okay. So then we are charging out towards combat, and actually even before takeoff we probably want to burn from the forward fuselage tank so that the aircraft becomes less stable as we go, and we need to look at the mission and see how much gas we're going to burn before we get to combat. So we're going to burn 1800 plus 800 plus 2000 plus 600. So I'm just going to do a summation of that right here. And see if I can make it all, take it all from the forward fuselage tank. Okay, so how much is that? That's 5,065 pounds. I don't think I want to take all that from the forward fuselage tank. Well, there isn't that much in the forward fuselage tank. I want to leave a little bit in there. It probably is a great way to ensure that things will feed properly. So what I'm going to do is reduce the forward fuselage tank by 3,000 pounds. Okay? So I'm just going to say minus 3,000. And this step is burn forward fuselage tank. Notice the center of gravity came back a long ways when I did that. Now I'm only 2% stable, which is good because when I go supersonic, my neutral point is going to shift back. The airplane will become more stable, and it'll minimize trim drag if I'm not very stable subsonically before I go supersonic. So now this is 26.63%, and the weight is 36,300. Okay. So now I am ready to super cruise, I think. Well, let's see where I am on the mission. I burned 3,000 pounds, so I burned 1,800. That's about, I'm halfway through my cruise when I decide to switch tanks. Okay. So I can put all of these labels, start, taxi, takeoff, acceleration, climb, and cruise, on that first 3,000 pound fuel burn when I get to the diagram. Okay? So the next thing I'm going to do is burn the rest of that fuel, 5265. So I'm going to burn that fuel from the two wing tanks. So it's each one is going to be reduced by 2265 divided by 2. Okay, that'll move my CG forward somewhat. Now it's 24.89. And it's easy to get lost. Be sure you're reading from the current. This says total at takeoff, but now I'm zeroing things out, so it's the current. This one doesn't change because it's the landing CG, or in other words, tanks dry, weapons gone CG is what's shown. Alright, and the new weight is 34,035. Okay. Alright, now I'm going to do combat. And let's check I burned 1472 in combat. Okay. And I really want to burn that from the fuselage tank to get less stable. There may be other considerations, but assuming you trust the wing tanks to feed properly, I'm going to burn that, what do we say, 1472 from the fuselage tank. Okay? Minus 1472. Okay? That leaves a little over 500 pounds of gas in the fuselage tank that'll probably feed no matter what. Alright, so this is the combat fuel burn. Now the CG is at 27.69%, and the weight is 32,563. Okay? And now we shoot our weapons. And I'm just going to shoot all the weapons. We could shoot the forward, shoot the back, but I don't think that's smart. I think you want to take turns, and eventually all those weapons are going to be gone, and the CG will move a minimal amount as each weapon is fired. If there was a concern about that, you'd go ahead and do each one weapon at a time and get the CG travel for each weapon firing. But in this case, we were still a little stable. We remain stable when the weapons are gone. I think it will be okay. We are subsonic, though, however, so this is the stability we're dealing with when we're doing our maneuvering. Okay, so now we're at 27.78%. CG didn't move much at all by the time all the weapons are gone, and we're at 29.883. Okay. And then we probably on the way back we're going to burn all the wing tanks first. So we'll set those to 0. And that puts our CG at 25.27. And now at this point we're probably actually on the ground with only 500 pounds of gas remaining. And the weight is 27,162. And now we're probably on the ground taxiing in, burning the last 500 pounds of gas. So we'll zero that out. And the CG ends up at the landing CG. 26.47%. And the weight is 26,648. Alright, so that's the normal mission profile, or the ideal mission fuel burn. And just for fun, we can plot that. We highlight those, we go insert. We don't want a line plot, we want a scatter plot, and this may look a little different on your version, but that doesn't. So there's the scatter plot. Looks like it didn't auto scale very well, so we can artificially do that. The interface varies a little from version to version, but it all has the same functionality. Here we're going to format the axis, and we want to start maybe at 25,000. So we go fix 25,000, and that spread that out. We want to start this axis at 20%. And that's pretty good. We may have to change this eventually because when we go most forward CG, it may take us forward of 20%. I'm not sure yet. Alright, so there's our mission CG travel diagram. I'm going to change the name of this first series and call it Ideal Fuel Burn, and then we'll do the other two, and we'll make the whole potato diagram. So this is what you would use for the mission fuel CG travel. Okay, the mission CG travel. It would look like this perhaps, and you could also plot vertical lines for the forward CG limit, the rear CG limit, and the neutral point location. That gives people an idea how much stability you have. They can read the percents. These limits are set by the RFP at plus 5% static margin and minus 5% static margin. So with the neutral point here, if the CG goes 5% Mach aft of the neutral point, these distances are measured from the nose, then that would be out the that would be at the aft CG limit. If the CG goes 5% ahead of the neutral point, that would be at the forward CG limit. So I think you can you know how to plot vertical lines on a plot. You can see the rest of the plot there, and we can put the labels on in PowerPoint as we showed in another video. Alright, but let's do the other two cases real quick and show what those would look like. So this is this one now is the most forward CG case. Okay, and we'll have these same two labels here, column labels, and we're going to start at the same place. Okay, we may not end up quite at the same place. Well, we'll end up at the same place, but not perhaps in the same number of steps, because we didn't burn all of the fuel tanks in order or anything like that. But now we're going to try to get a most forward CG. We'll fix most. It's got an extra M. There we go. Most forward CG. Remember, I saved these guys down here so that I could put them back and easily reset to a full aircraft. And now I'm going to burn worst case and get the most out of CG, out of limit CG I can. So to get the most forward CG, I'm going to expend things from the rear, starting in the rear and then moving forward. So the first thing I'm going to do is shoot the rear missiles. So I make that value 0, because that has the highest coordinate, so that's the most aft thing. And I get my CG at 19.61%. and my weight is 37,960. Okay. Then I expend or burn all of the fuel in the wing tanks, which are the most aft fuel tanks in this design. So now I'm at 14. So these are out of limits, but you'd never do that in this way. 14.59%, and the weight is 32,974. Okay, and then the next aft thing is the forward missiles. So I'm going to zero those out. And that gives me CG of 16.46% and a weight of 316.34. Then the last thing, I told you we don't have as many steps as the other time because we burned all the fuel tanks at once, but we finally burned the fuselage fuel tank and we end up down here. We could really just copy this and put it right there. Okay, and that's our second. That's our most forward. So let's go select data. Let's add most forward, X values, okay, and Y values. Okay. So as I said before, we're going to have to redo this, and we'll make this, it goes to about 14, so let's make it 15. Let's try 15. Still going a little out, so let's try 14, I guess. Should have known that wasn't going to work. Okay, so now we have the rear half of our potato. And this last little bit here, the two lines are laying on top of each other. This one doesn't end here, it goes all the way down to there. Because it has to end at the same point, and you can see that it does end at the same point. Okay. So now we need to do most aft CG. And that's the last thing I'll show you. I'm sure you can figure out the plotting or already understand how to plot in Excel and from the other videos. I'm going to start at the same point as before because that's how we always start. I'm going to end up at the same point, and I could probably, I know it's going to be the same number of steps because I've got the same number of locations. So I can put that over here now too. And then I have to reset my fuels and weight, payload. So I copy that up there and I'm back to my starting point, 21.77%. This time we're trying for the most aft CG, so let me label that so it's clear what we're doing, most aft. And so now I'm going to burn the most forward thing first and try to get the CG to move aft as far as possible. The most forward thing in this design is the fuselage fuel tank, so I'm going to set that to 0. And my new CG is 30.32%. And my new weight is 34,314. The next forward thing is the forward missiles, so I'll set those to 0. Now I'm at 32.75%, and my weight is 32,974. And then I'll burn all of my fuel tanks, all my wing tanks. Okay, and that will put me at 29.17% and 27,988. And then the last thing is this forward missiles, and we end up where we were. So let's plot that one so that you can see that. I'm going to reset the scale before I do that, so I'm going to set this to, I look down at 33 on the top, at the top end, so that what we plot here will fit. And then I'm going to select data. This is I'm going to add. This is going to be most aft. The X data does this, and the Y data does this, and voila, your potato grid diagram. You can see how some of the events occur in the same order. We started the ideal mission burning from the forward fuel tank, but we didn't burn all of it. And then we burned from the wing tanks. And shooting missiles, they're pretty evenly distributed around the CG, so they didn't, in the end, shift anything. Although if we wanted to show 2 stages of that, we could have another leg right in there. And we did show those 2 stages when we did the worst cases. But the ideal case, you shoot 1 missile from each bay, and the CG never moves very far. So that's how you make a potato diagram. You can tell why it's called a potato diagram, because it more or less looks like a potato, although this one looks a little bit like a box. There's one more point to be made about this. When making these potato diagrams, do not use smooth lines. In a lot of plots, we do use smooth lines because we know nature mostly works in smooth lines. But when fuel feeds, or when we fire a missile, it's a pretty much digital event. Fuel feeds, and then we change valves and we feed from a different tank. So this should not be a smooth line through these points here. Likewise, when we fire a missile, it's a sudden event. Yes, there is at some microcosmic level, there is a little smoothing. It takes a while for a valve to close and another valve to open. It takes a while for a missile to fire. But on the level here, where we've got hours is the time scale, although we're not plotting time, these events are linear, pretty much, and linear in weight and CG. The fuel burn may not be linear as we modulate the throttle, but in time, but in weight and CG it's quite linear, and it's a quite sharp change to another direction. So the point is, don't smooth the lines when you choose the type of scatter plot to plot.